Good afternoon. I hope everybody enjoyed lunch. I'm John Alterman. I'm the Senior Vice President here, Director of the Middle East Program. One of the great joys of being in Washington is sometimes you're in an environment where you get to be the dumbest guy in the room. I think I'm here as the dumbest guy in the panel. The people that we have talking now, and we envision this sort of as a way to capture some of the strategic wisdom, are just three people for whom I have tremendous respect. Lieutenant General Mike Nagata, your title, it is the most difficult title, the Director of the Directorate of Strategic Operational Planning.
Worst name ever.
But the job is incredible. He was the commander of the Special Operations Forces in the U.S. Central Command, and now is with the National Counterterrorism Center, thinking all of the strategic thoughts that I think we have been struggling with in many ways all morning. We're very grateful for you to take the time to be with us. John McLaughlin, as many of you know, was the acting director of Central Intelligence, was the deputy director for intelligence at the CIA. I have grown reliant on him for the person who comes to our small meetings and is able to distill the strategic points that everybody has been struggling to articulate, and he manages to capture in a way that I just find breathtaking. Christine Wormuth, former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy, an old and valued colleague of mine here at CSIS, whenever we had the internal things to work through, having Christine on my team was always a sign that we're going to be successful. She's currently directing the Adrian Arsh Center for Resilience at the Atlantic Council. So what we have are people with tremendous intellectual ability and government experience to help us think about where are we trying to take it? Where is all this going? When we talk about counterterrorism in North Africa, how much should we care about it? What should we be doing about it? When should we stop focusing on it? When should we start focusing on it? Because it's very easy to take something small and to say this is the problem. But what we have here is a panel of people who have thought and acted worldwide. And I think they can help us both contextualize what's happening in North Africa and think about what it is that we're all trying to do. So I think we'll start with General Nagata if we can, and then work down. Do we have any benchmarks for strategic success or failure? Can we conceive of benchmarks for strategic success or failure when we're thinking about a problem like fighting terrorism in North Africa?
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me to be here today. I think you should always start with me because whatever I say is going to be improved on by the other two panelists here. And unfortunately, I'll demonstrate that with the way I'm going to answer your question. In order to describe a benchmark, you actually have to know where you're going. Otherwise, you don't know whether or not whatever you're looking at is actually a benchmark on the road to your destination. I know that we're here to speak principally about the Maghreb, but what I'm about to say, I think you can conflate to virtually everything we confront when it comes to countering terrorism, both as the United States and as a member of the international community. I was recently asked in another panel a very kind of similar question. It wasn't asked about benchmarks, but I was asked a more simple question about what are we winning? I would argue in order to know you're winning, you have to be hitting your benchmarks. But anyways, here's my basic answer. I would argue the world is still struggling with inconsistency about what our goals are. The United States does articulate certain goals when it comes to countering terrorism and countering violent extremism. The problem is, in too many cases, our definition of what constitutes sufficient success is often very different from what other actors, other nations, other communities are describing as their goals. And so long as that is true, the search for benchmarks proves to be pretty elusive. Now, so that I don't completely come across like I'm trying to dodge your question, I'll float a couple of ideas that may be of some utility to you or the people that are observing this event. One might make the argument that our goal is, as the United States, this is specific to the United States, is to avoid another 9/11. It's a commendable goal, and so far we haven't had a repeat of that awful event. If that is our goal, then I could potentially describe some benchmarks for this part of Africa that help us pursue that goal. But the real problem with having a repeat of 9/11 as our goal is we will have to do that forever. There's no end to preventing another 9/11 unless there are some other things we're willing to do that don't involve preventing a catastrophic attack, but avoid the creation of the ability and the desire to conduct a catastrophic attack. Another way to define our goals is by characterizing the capabilities that we think we need. An example, I'll use this example because as a military officer, it's the one I'm most familiar with, but should the United States, should our partners in this particular part of the world have the ability to identify a danger, a threat, a malign actor who intends to do harm, track that individual or that group of individuals, and then ultimately use the appropriate capability to arrest, to detain, or if necessary, take military action against those actors? Sure, that's necessary, and we've done a great deal of that along with our international partners around the world, but it has the same basic problem that preventing another 9/11 has, and that is you're going to have to do it forever. Where this really drives us to, and I would argue this is particularly appropriate for a conversation about Africa, is should our goal be undoing the root causes, the drivers? There are many different descriptions that you can hear both publicly and privately about this, but it's basically removing the causes, the drivers that propel vulnerable individuals and vulnerable groups into the path of radicalization and ultimately mobilization to violence. I would argue that's the best goal. But identifying the benchmarks for that journey is actually much harder than the benchmarks for taking physical action, because this has to do with what people believe, this has to do with what people perceive, this has to do with deep-seated emotional, psychological, cultural, societal drivers that often big governments are not in a good position to generate a lot of skill against. So at the end, it probably does sound like I've dodged your question, but identifying benchmarks without a consistent definition of what we're trying to do has never struck me as a particularly useful endeavor, and frankly, it ends up being futile.
And one of the problems with trying to promote economic development abroad is we've been trying to do it as a U.S. government for 70 years with kind of checkered success. So, Mr. McLaughlin, save us from ourselves.
Gee. Well, I'm glad we've switched to Game of Thrones here. I feel good about that. Thank you for inviting me and this panel. You gave us about 10 questions, and I'm going to take a look at maybe 4 of them. One of them is one you just asked about benchmarks. The others have to do with what priority this should have in American policy. Whether the right, that's number one, whether the right structures are in place to deal with it. What is the trajectory of terrorism in this part of the world? And whether the right benchmarks are there. And let me start by saying that listening to the panelists today and thinking about the problem, I think this area and this set of problems deserves the highest priority in U.S. Attention to counterterrorism. And I think it's because there are at least 4 characteristics here that I don't see present in the same measure in any other part of the world. First, you have linkages among these groups. that are very pronounced. I'm going to come back to that with a case study. Second, you have very weak borders. Third, you have something that reinforces that problem, which is vast, ungoverned spaces or loosely governed spaces. And finally, you have what I think General Nagata was referring to in his last remark, which is a set of socioeconomic, cultural conditions that are challenging, to say the least, when it comes to formation of attitudes and so forth. You have all four of those things kind of converging in this area in ways that I don't see them converge in, say, Europe, Southeast Asia, or certainly not in our own hemisphere. So I will tell you my perspective on this is shaped to a large degree. I'm not a North Africa specialist. I've spent a lot of time on counterterrorism. But I did delve into a North African problem in conjunction with the president of CSIS, John Hamre, when we were both on a panel to advise a Norwegian oil company, Statoil, with regard to a terrorist attack that it had experienced in In Amenas, Algeria, where they were managing a natural gas facility in conjunction with the Algerian oil company and BP, so three of them. This occurred in 2013, and to refresh your memory, this facility, which is about 40 kilometers, as I recall, inside the Algerian border from Libya, was attacked by a gang of terrorists led by Mukhtar Belmokhtar, and close to 40 hostages died. This was a really major event, which was briefly noted in the international press, but not given the kind of attention that it deserved as a kind of benchmark, if you will, for a variety of things. And among the things I took away from it was the first point I made about linkages among these groups. Because when we looked at the terrorists who had attacked this under Belmokhtar, I counted at least 8 nationalities involved. I don't know that I can list them all, but there were Egyptians, Tunisians, Canadians, believe it or not, at least 2 Canadians, Mauritanians, Malians, and I'm leaving someone out, but there were at least, say again? Niger. There were at least 8. And what I took from that was you can assemble a pretty strong terrorist group that crosses a lot of lines here very easily in that part of the world, and you can move across a border. When I looked at the satellite imagery, commercial imagery, of that border between Libya and Algeria, I said to someone, not to make a joke about terrorist attacks, but I said, give me a Land Rover and I can probably organize a group here to go and attack something. I didn't see any controls along that border that were at least visible from space. So that sort of affected my perception of the problem in this area. And that takes me to my second point that I wanted to talk about, which is, so first point is, a lot of things combine to make this a more fertile environment for terrorist development, plotting, and activity than most parts of the world. And part of the first point again, I think it makes classic counterterrorism much harder than it is almost anywhere else. Again, I'm coming back to General Nagata's point just a moment ago about the difference between action on the ground and harder things to get at. My sort of thumbnail way of thinking about counterterrorism, a little simple-minded, but sometimes you have to be, is you need to do 3 things to defeat a terrorist phenomenon. You have to destroy the leadership, you must deny it safe haven, and you must change the conditions that give rise to the phenomenon. what General Nagata was talking about was number 3, I think. It's one thing to attack the leadership, it's another to deny it safe haven. And by the way, I don't think we've done those two things in this part of the world, attacked leadership to a degree, but certainly haven't denied it safe haven. Though there are pockets where that might be true, for example, along the Algerian-Moroccan border. But that third one, change the conditions, that's something that my old profession, intelligence, can't do by itself. We can work the first two. But changing conditions means an all-of-government approach, but really an all-of-government multilateral, multinational approach. And I'll just leave it at that. The dimensions of that are impressive. But then go to my second point about are the right solutions and the right structures in place. Given that terrorists can cross boundaries so easily in this part of the world and clearly share logistics and other things, and are all, as one of the earlier panelists mentioned, entwined with other phenomena such as corruption and organized crime and smuggling, I can't think that the right structures are in place to substantially attack the problem, in part because, and here I'm just drawing on my own experience in our hemisphere and in Europe, the key to this is fusion of data, not just fusion of kinetic capability, but fusion of data. That requires information sharing at a sophisticated level, and that's hard for us to do here. We're dramatically better at it than we were at the time of 9/11. But I see our European counterparts with much longer history of working this, still struggling with it as they attempt to cope with the kind of attacks that we've seen in Europe over the last several years. So I'm not familiar enough with the innards of this area to know how hard it is, but I suspect it's very difficult, because to do it successfully you need trust, you need information technology that is multilateral, you need joint operations to build that trust, and you need ways of what we call sanitizing the information in order to pass it without revealing sources. That's all hard stuff to do. So I think that some things are underway. The Sahel Multilateral Planning Group, for example, may be a kind of a nascent model. It involves a number of the Mediterranean countries on the European side, plus Tunisia. And something like that seems to me to be needed in greater measure. Now I'll make two other quick points because I've gone on longer than I intended, but two other questions I wanted to answer were, are military solutions helpful? And yes, of course. There has to be a military component. I'll just shorthand this by saying the danger, but it, in my judgment, ought to focus, and General Nagata should speak to this, I think it ought to focus primarily on the fusion of special operations and intelligence versus what we might call large military. I think when big military gets involved, you run the risk, particularly in a part of the world like this, of driving moderates underground. So the military component here needs to be stealthy almost to the point of invisibility, in my judgment. And finally, you wanted to talk about the trajectory of terror in this part of the world. I think I would just say, in shorthand, I think it's, even though some of the earlier panelists had cited some data about decreased number of incidents in 2017, I think we can't put too much weight on 1 year's data. If you look at the data over the last, let's say since 2001, in 2001, the data I'm familiar with is there were a little over 20 terrorist incidents in North Africa, Sahel, and Sub-Saharan Africa to a point. And in 2016, I think there were 235. depending on who's doing the counting, I suppose. But the trajectory has been up, and given the conditions I just walked through, I would, if I were a betting person, and it turns out I am, I would say that the trajectory is going to continue to be up, but with the potential of, it struck me from the panelists speaking earlier that there is acute awareness of the problem and many efforts underway to combat it. So it's not a hopeless situation, but it's a tough one. So I would leave it there and turn to Christine.
Thank you. It's always fun to bat cleanup at the panel. But I'm also delighted to be here, John. It's really nice to be back. And General Nagata, it's great to see you. We had the pleasure to work together in difficult circumstances, but that was always lots of fun. I wanted to say a few things about, add a little bit to what John had to say about strategy for counterterrorism in the region, add a few thoughts about what I think success looks like, and then close with a couple of comments on priority and time frame. I think I had originally envisioned the CT strategy as being sort of a three-legged stool. I think John has made me think it's more of a chair now with four legs. If the one leg is going after leadership, another leg is the denying a physical safe haven, a third leg is the one I think I didn't hear John mention, which is denying the virtual safe haven, where we see so much of the counter-radicalization happening, and where I think we've seen a lot of these groups develop very sophisticated media strategies to get out their narrative, to do recruitment that sadly has been very effective. And then the fourth leg of the chair, which I think is arguably the most important one, but also the most difficult one to work on, is what General Nagata was talking about, which is addressing the underlying conditions that can lead to violent extremism and terrorism. And that's really about getting at governance and getting at rooting out corruption, building the capacity of ministries to be able to provide security, to provide services, to provide economic opportunities. That is a very long-term effort, and I think it's a critical one that often doesn't get as much attention, because I think certainly in my experience in the last administration, there's a tendency to reach for that military tool in the toolkit. It's a very developed tool, it's a very proficient tool, it's a very well-resourced tool, and so policymakers tend to reach for that very often. And really, if we really want to be successful, I think we need to be reaching for those, for the diplomatic tools, the development tools, the economic and trade tools, and we don't do that as much, I think, in part because they aren't as well resourced, and certainly we in the United States government don't have the same amount of capacity there. But also those, using those tools, applying those tools, I think the fruits of that labor takes much longer to become evident. And certainly, again, in the United States, I think our public, our politicians are anxious for results and want to see things sort of now. Anyone who's ever had the opportunity to testify in front of Congress knows that it's all about, show me how this is working now. And if there's not a lot of patience or appetite for give us 2 years, give us 5 years, and then you'll really see this start to take off. But frankly, that's a lot of what I think is most needed, because otherwise we're just going to be playing whack-a-mole and focusing on doing the best we can to prevent the next 9/11, which, as General Nagata said, is going to be a job that we'll be doing in perpetuity. I think when I think about what does success look like, I think of it a little bit as sort of crawl, walk, run. In the near term, I think success would be are we able to do everything we can to prevent a major attack? And are we able to get a much better handle around all of the foreign fighters, where they are now, where they're going, what their plans are? That, to me, I think is sort of a starter goal. And I think, moving more into the mid to longer term, it's about really trying to develop capable and sustainable security institutions, both on the military side, but also on the intelligence side, looking at ministries of interior, looking at counter-radicalization programs. And I think Morocco in particular has done some good work in that area. In the Obama administration, I think in the last couple of years, we were making some progress there and getting a little bit smarter about how we were doing that and looking more to the private sector and the civil society sector. And my hope is that we're not losing ground in that area, but frankly, I'm not entirely sure what we're really doing there. And I think when you think about what do we need to do to build that capacity in the security sector, a key piece, I think, is really putting together mechanisms so that the different ministries in countries in the region can be communicating and coordinating effectively amongst themselves, first and foremost, then going out and being able to coordinate with neighboring countries, and then again, with multilateral institutions, with things like the European Union, with things like NATO. Those reforms and that cooperation and coordination, I think, is really, really essential. But again, if we don't start getting to that longer term, getting to the causes of weak governance, I think we're going to be in this for a very long time. I think I would just close with a couple of comments. One of the concerns that I have in this area is about the mismatch, if you will, between the scale of the threat and the challenge that we're facing and the resources that we're able to put against it. Whether you're talking about countries in the region themselves, which obviously have a number of fiscal challenges, but also looking at the United States, at European countries. We just don't have the resources really that are needed right now, it seems to me, to grapple with this. We got the Counterterrorism Partnership Fund a couple of years ago. That was a useful start, but I think there's so much more that's needed. And unfortunately, I don't think that Santa Claus is coming with a bag of money anytime soon, unfortunately. And I think that's, as someone who served as the Undersecretary of Policy at Defense, where we really had to look at the global suite of issues. I think if you're a Secretary of State or a Secretary of Defense right now, and you're thinking about what are the real priorities for the United States of America and the challenges that it's facing in the world, the really big tectonic shifts that are going on right now, I think, are happening with China and what it's doing. And clearly China is rising and is becoming much more present and assertive in the world. And I think there are some things about that are fine. There are other things, I think, from the perspective of the United States that are much more concerning. And that has to be front and center on the minds of our policymakers. Similarly, Russia. Russia, I think, is a much weaker power than China, but has a very strong military, and clearly, I think, is being unhelpful in any number of ways. And so if you're looking at a finite US government budget and you're trying to figure out where to put your money, a lot of it is going to go to those big things. And I think it's going to, it's going to be harder to find the money to deal with the challenges that are present in the Maghreb. And I think that puts a premium on all of us who are involved in that work, trying to spend what we have now, hold on to what we have, fight in Congress for what we have, but really try to use that money as effectively as possible and to collaborate with our partner countries in the region, with our EU countries, to really try and find out, okay, if you're working on this area and you all, if France and the UK have kind of got this covered, then let's have the United States work over here and not overlap and work on the same thing twice, because the resources right now are precious and scarce. I'll just stop there.
Thank you. All of you touched on the problem of partners and our need to work with partners. And that's a challenge, because in a lot of cases, the agencies we'd want to work on counterterrorism, on the one hand, are in contradiction to the forces that might want to, or that might encourage greater pluralism, greater political openness. Mohammed Mesbah earlier today talked about how humiliation seems to be a thread among a lot of the people who get radicalized, and people are being radicalized increasingly quickly. As the US government thinks about working with partners, one of the challenges we have is the most important partners are often troubling partners, have troubling practices. We can preach to them. Sometimes they don't want to talk to us. I've been told there are some countries that they said, don't talk to the Ministry of the Interior, except if you're looking at that fourth leg, the Ministry of the Interior is key, and if you're looking at policing, the Ministry of Interior is key. how do we think about that problem? We have important partners who are difficult for us to work with because they don't share our analysis of the problem and they don't share our analysis of the solution. I won't start with you because you've been on this spot enough. John, can you take a hit at that?
Well, it's complicated. Let me start there. You know, it's particularly complicated because of the passage through the period that we call the Arab Spring. Beginning in 2010, 2011, there was, as you all will know and remember, this upsurge of desire for change and modernization generally across this region, beginning in Tunisia. And I think Morocco, of course, generally escaped that difficult period, in large part because the king had for a decade or so been well along the reform path, and also Morocco is not, I don't want to offend anyone by putting it this way, but Morocco is not an entirely Arab country, as you all know. So it's a more complex society. But that period of time, I think left, because you've got to start with what is U.S. policy here. That period of time left U.S. policy in a bit of a quandary, because we had been working with all of the preceding regimes, many of which had shown little attention to the latent desires of populations. So I can tell you that in my former profession, intelligence agencies here had good relationships with intelligence agencies in that part of the world prior to the Arab Spring. As John mentioned, simultaneously working with them and simultaneously lecturing them to a degree on human rights. In many parts of the world, that was our operating motif. That's one reason why I say it's complicated. But at the end of the day, it comes down to a question of what are your priorities. If your priorities are to defeat terrorists, you work with those who can help you achieve that, if that's your priority. But you also have to be aware that what you're doing tactically may work against what you're doing strategically. You with me so far? That's why I say it's complicated. And I don't think there's an easy way around this. Between the balance, striking that balance between appropriately messaging your foreign partners about what your preference is with regard to human rights policies, democratization on the one hand, and at the same time drawing from them the kind of cooperation that you need and that they need in order to achieve a threat to the lives of their citizens. That's the dilemma. And you have to look for that balance. And I think that balance has been even more elusive since the Arab Spring, in part because in many cases, security services, intelligence services, if you will, turned over, disappeared, were reformed, restructured with new leadership. And that new leadership, in many cases, is trying to figure out, take Egypt as a case in point, that new leadership is trying to figure out, we haven't talked about Egypt, but that new leadership is trying to figure out not just its relationship with you, but with its role in a new society. This must be going on in Tunisia, and with the requirement, relatively new, to work with and be loyal to elected civilian officials as distinct from either long-term dictatorships or monarchies. So that's another thing that makes this complicated. when you say something's complicated, you risk leaving the audience with the feeling that you're saying, and so nothing can be done. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is there's a balance to be struck here which makes the job harder, and that's just the world we live in and the task that you have if you're in a job like Christine had, or that like General Nagata has now, or that I once had. It's just one of the things that makes your life difficult but not boring, to find that right balance and get it right. Did I answer your question?
Not precisely. Christine, can you remember some of the more difficult struggles that you that you had on this?
You know, I was thinking as you asked the question, John, I have the pleasure of teaching at Georgetown University this fall as an adjunct in their security studies program. And we've been looking at all sorts of historical case studies, but more recently we were looking at the situation in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And we were looking at the manual that the Army has used to conduct counterinsurgency operations, which again is not the same obviously as counterterrorism, but when General Petraeus came in and had the manual rewritten, one of the big things he emphasized was governance, that, again, it's not just about providing security, you really have to work on the governance piece. But the first time that the manual was written, field manual, that's right, I forget the number, but when the field manual was written, the whole discussion of providing assistance on the governance side was very apolitical, and it sort of assumed that you had a host country partner that shared the same goals that you had, that had completely clean hands, that wasn't, engaging in any activity that was counterproductive to the needs of its citizens, that wasn't engaged in any kind of a graft or enriching of itself. And frankly, that's not really the case in most cases. And I think that's one of the big challenges is, as we think about whether it's counterterrorism or counterinsurgency or, trying to sort of work to strengthen fragile states, the assistance on the governance side can't be administered through an apolitical lens, because it's just not going to be an apolitical situation. And I think that means that very much with what John was just saying, you have to be sort of steering in between the right and left guardrails of making your aid and assistance conditional on cooperation in certain areas, but also acknowledging the reality that in some cases, if you are completely rigid about that conditionality, you may fundamentally alienate your host country partner and wind up, deeply severing the bilateral relationship. I can remember, we struggled with this when I was in government, whether it came to Egypt or Pakistan, I mean, you name it. And I think, you have to sort of, I think of it a little bit as a highway that you're driving down, and you have guardrails on the left and right, and you're trying to sort of steer between them. You're trying to have enough conditionality to try to elicit the kinds of behavior that is needed so that a government is doing what its people needs it to be doing. But at the same time recognizing that if you insist on that kind of purity at every single moment, you're going to probably alienate yourself from the authorities that are in power, and then you're sort of cutting off your nose to spite your face. So it's kind of an unsatisfying, murky middle, but I think that is in fact the reality in most cases. And the difficult part I always found as a policymaker was how to know when to move the steering wheel. Because on the one hand, you'll have people saying that, we absolutely have to stand up for human rights and freedom of the press and all of those things, or we're completely undermining our credibility. And then you'll have the people, usually at the Defense Department, saying, come on, you've got to be realistic. We've got to, we're going to have to sell them some weapons and things like that if we're going to get any cooperation on this other side. And it's very difficult in the moment to know what those right judgments are. And generally what we do then is punt to the IC and say, give us a better intelligence estimate.
She said what I meant.
So let me just maybe narrow it a little bit, and then
Okay.
if you want to answer the broker's question, because I thought the comments Christine made about conditionality
Yes.
are really interesting, especially for somebody who has been in Special Operations Command. I remember getting a presentation from the guys in Tampa, and they had printed in bold on the pamphlets was, you can't surge trust.
Yep.
Conditionality undermines their belief that you have their backs.
Yep.
How, given your experience, how should we think about conditionality to deal with the strategic objectives of helping these countries deal with the underlying drivers of the terrorism?
I think there's a direct connection between what you just asked and this broader topic of what is the idea of partnering with people around the world. Nobody's going to be your partner if they don't trust you. You can call them a partner, but if there's no trust, they're just somebody you know. I think particularly from the strategic lens of dealing with violent extremism in a place like Africa, we have to understand what the interests of all the stakeholders are and at least demonstrate some regard and some respect for those interests, or they're never going to be our partners. There are at least 4 broad groups of people that have an enormous strategic stake in either the negative continuance of terrorism or eventually the resolution of terrorism in this part of the world. There, of course, are the people of the region themselves, the people of the Maghreb states, the people who live in North Africa. They probably have the biggest stake because they live or die by the outcome here. And the fortune of their children will be determined by whether or not whether or not this evil either continues or is eventually brought to an end. The Europeans have a massive stake in this. This is their near abroad. We're already seeing the consequences of the migrant crisis, all these other things. It is having a debilitating effect on European perceptions of their own security. It's already been mentioned here once, I might as well mention it here. The Chinese have a rapidly growing economic interest in this part of the world, and we would be foolish not to take that into account. And then finally, there are our own interests. There are threats to the United States. Our own vital interests are at stake when it comes to this part of the world. But getting back to your point, do we have a construct, a strategic construct, by which all the interests of at least these 4 stakeholders, and there are actually more than I've listed, but at least these 4 broad stakeholders, do we even have a mechanism by which the security and stability interests of all these stakeholders are harmonized? The answer is not yet. There is some work underway to try to create what I've just described, but it is very early. And we have a long way to go. But until we do, the idea of having an effective international partnership for dealing with this incredibly complex region that often beggars description, it's so complicated, is going to prove pretty elusive. Now, 3 last things. I'm going to take the liberty of referring back to a couple of things my colleagues said here because I think they relate to the question you've asked. I think North Africa, the Maghreb, is going to be a test case of whether or not the international community, not just the United States, can demonstrate effectiveness against terrorism and violent extremism without large-scale military campaigns. We have Operation Inherent Resolve going on in Libya and Iraq right now. Previously, we had Operation Enduring Freedom and the like. The United States is not going to do something like that in Africa. It'd be politically unacceptable. We can't afford it. There's all kinds of reasons we're not going to do it. Yet we have just as high a need for strategic success in the Maghreb as we have anywhere else in the contest against terrorism. So we're going to have to rely on instruments that traditionally enjoy far less manpower, far less resources, and far less policy support, not just in the United States, but quite literally around the world. Things like preventing the international travel of terrorists and foreign fighters. Things like denying them resources. Typically, we call this counter-finance. I think that's too narrow. It's denying them resources of all types. Effectively contesting them on the internet. both as a command and control instrument and as a radicalization platform. Unfortunately, extremists everywhere are becoming much more proficient in both usages of the internet. Fighting the ideology, whether it's on the internet, in a neighborhood, in a family, in a mosque, anywhere, fighting the idea that appears very attractive to even though it's a small fraction of the world's population or of the African population, it still results in thousands of terrorists. And then finally, terrorism prevention. What our government has typically styled as countering violent extremism for several years, but regardless of what you call it, it's identifying vulnerable individuals and groups and persuading them not to take the path to radicalization, so they can never be mobilized to violence in the end. These things don't involve 500-pound bombs. These things could be supported by a military operation, but they're not typically done by military actors. But as I've already indicated, the resources, manpower, and genuine policy support tend to be a fraction of what is committed to large-scale military operations. So I think Africa will be a test case of whether or not just the United States, whether or not the international community is capable of making the shift to equally important, but generally far less resourced and far less supported counterterrorism activities. And then finally, I think two things immediately emerge from what I just said, assuming you buy what I just said. The first is there's going to be a much larger role for non-governmental actors in this kind of effort than we've seen in the past. People are not tethered to a government. Civil society actors, non-governmental organizations are going to have to be a much more prominent part of such efforts. That makes it much more complicated. And then finally, something John alluded to that I think we should never have a counterterrorism forum without mentioning. I think we should be very careful about taking comfort from statistics about the incidence of violence. It's very important to remember that the classic definition of terrorism is the use of violence to create political change. The tempo of violence and the political change the bad actor is trying to create are not necessarily tied particularly strongly to each other. You can have episodic, low volumes of violence that create political havoc. I'll stop there.
You don't want to take on conditionality?
Conditionality. Well, in a way, I was trying to allude to it when I started. Our conditionality is based on our interests. We will give you this so long as you don't do this or you do this. It's all tethered to our interests. What's very difficult, not just for the United States government, for all governments, is to sacrifice some of our own interests in order to make common cause. That's a very difficult conversation to have. It's a very difficult conversation to have inside a government. It's a very difficult conversation to have internationally, because often, as soon as somebody realizes what you're potentially offering is to sacrifice one of your own interests, they immediately approach the conversation with enormous skepticism. Prove to me you're willing to sacrifice something that historically has been important to you in the interest of finding common cause with me. I don't believe it until you do it. Yet, I mean, there have been so many examples over centuries of building alliances, coalitions, leagues against common enemies. It requires all actors to surrender some of their conditionality, to surrender some of their interest in order to forge the team that is actually required.
Let me just quickly ask one more question before we go to the audience. One of the challenges, and I think you alluded to it, is it's not about numbers, it's about impact.
Right.
To the extent it stops having impact, it stops having impact, you can't marshal resources. To the extent it has impact, it drives us in the direction of more military solutions, which have quick results. How should we unpack the problem that the stimulus seems to be driving us away from the sort of holistic solutions of sort of inclusion and inclusive development? Are there strategies we can take that can give us a more enduring durability on the kinds of policies that you're arguing for?
I'll start. This is going to probably sound overly simplistic, but this is actually a pretty frequent conversation that I have with people in my current job of trying to formulate strategy. Whether we realize it or not, we decide what we react to. That's a choice we make. I was looking at an actuarial table a few weeks ago, the causes of mortality around the world. It was basically an insurance actuarial table. One of the things I saw is I have a higher likelihood of being killed by a household pet than I do by a terrorist. I have a much higher likelihood of being killed in a car accident on the way back to Liberty Crossing later this afternoon than I do of ever being killed by a terrorist, particularly with the Washington, D.C. traffic the way it is these days. But in all seriousness, but we don't decide to react with enormous political drama because of a car accident or the death from a household pet. We do decide to react politically to episodic, and of course every death, every injury is a tragedy, but we actually make the decision to react politically to episodic, low casualty producing events. And the United States is not the only country that does this. Pretty much every country does this. To a phenomenon that will kill far fewer people than traffic accidents will. We decide to react. Now, maybe that's a legitimate choice. Well, it is a legitimate choice. We're making it, but the price we pay is that everything has to be reacted to. It begs the question, is that wise?
I think the answer to your question, John, is that unfortunately you have to do it all at the same time. In my engagement with international problems, from the Middle East to Latin America to Europe and Africa, is that there is seldom success in taking one particular avenue of approach and following that kind of blindly and aggressively without looking peripherally at what's going on, either as a result of what you're doing or impacting the environment in which you're trying to succeed. So I think on terrorism, I come back to this idea that we in the United States need a whole of government approach carried out multilaterally. This is very, very hard, but it means that on something like North Africa and the Maghreb, and by the way, I think I put them together. I think drawing a line in North Africa is a little artificial, going back to the example I gave you of the In Amenas attack. North Africa, Maghreb, and parts of sub-Saharan Africa, all part of a big conglomerate problem. But in attacking that, you have to simultaneously build relations with the security services in those countries, work hard to increase their capabilities, work hard to increase their ability to work in coordination with each other. We have done this in other parts of the world. We've done this quite successfully in Southeast Asia, for example, and work internationally to coordinate, first to gain a consensus about the importance of supporting the values that we think will diminish the growth of terrorism and the policies necessary to support those values, and work multilaterally to bring that to bear on a region like this. That is really hard. That is really hard. And yet I think it's the only way to go about this. And inevitably it leads you to the conclusion we're not, we live on 4-year cycles in this country. We need to think about this as a long-term issue that will require, not just in North Africa, but in many parts of the world, constancy of leadership and policy over generations. That's the world we're living in. And one of the questions we haven't talked about is, how do we know we've ever succeeded? What's the benchmark for that? With terrorism, I think you have to let go of the idea that you're ever going to stamp it out completely. It's been there since biblical times at some level in all of recorded history. And so we need to get to the point where it is at, I'm looking for an analogy here, kind of the nuisance level. For example, take communism. With the exception of North Korea, that's a pretty big exception. No one worries about communism anymore as an ideological driver of events in the world, but it's still there. There are still communist parties in many countries. They still cause trouble. The Cold War survives in North Korea and maybe one or two other spots, but essentially that's over. That's kind of where I think we have to get with terrorism. There'll always be some of it, but we have to reach the point where, as a driver that grabs our attention and mobilizes all of our resources, as it tends to now, that's over. That's the benchmark for me. And we're a long way from that, frankly. And, you know, ultimately, this issue of conditionality does come down to a choice. Sometimes you can't have it all. Sometimes you have to make a choice. You have to make a choice on what your prevailing value is. Let me give you a very concrete spy story example. Prior to 9/11, in the decade of the 90s, the CIA was criticized for what were perceived to be human rights issues in Latin America. And we had something called the Deutsch rules, which were put in place by one of our former directors, saying essentially you could not recruit human sources, assets, spies, if they had a human rights record that was odious from the perception of the United States. Well, you don't learn about terrorism by talking to Mother Teresa. You know, you have to get your hands a little dirty to learn what you need to know to fight terrorism. And that's a persistent issue in the counterterrorism business. And we changed that, by the way. We broke that rule ourselves without being encouraged to break it, and before it was officially broken, prior to 9/11. I'll stop with the spy story there, but thank goodness we did, because it enabled us to respond very quickly to that horrendous event. But the choices you make have consequences.
I don't have anything to add.
Okay, we have some microphones. I would love if people would ask questions. Please identify yourself, and because we have a lot of people, I'd appreciate if you could limit yourself to one question. We'll start right over here, and then we'll go over here.
Thanks, Dov Zakheim. I've been hearing about whole of government since I was in the government. I'm still waiting for it to happen. What are your suggestions for making it happen? When I was in DOD, my boss, Rumsfeld, really wanted to work whole of government. And it didn't work because there was no other part of the government that would work with us. I used to say we were fighting 2 wars with 1.5 agencies, ours and half of state. When we wanted to send people from the Department of Agriculture to Afghanistan, we couldn't find people to sign up because most of them were paper pushers. How do you develop whole of government? And if you can't, why do you keep talking about it?
Go ahead.
we all wanna take a
You're trying to do it now.
I'll take a stab at it.
I'm ready on
That's
this
in
one.
theory, at least in the counterterrorism world, what my office is charged to do, at least in terms of strategy development, is to integrate the departments and agencies of government to design counterterrorism strategies. But here's my answer. By incentivizing integration, in other words, there are rewards for people who decide to integrate. One thing I think history has proven is we cannot order whole of government. We've tried that. People will find ways not to do it. because they don't see it as being in their interest. I take as my example the one case I have actually seen integration be incentivized in the United States government, and it was the creation of joint service and joint duty in the Department of Defense. Why, in my humble opinion, this is a personal opinion here, when I ask myself, why did Goldwater Nichols successfully create what we now see as normal in the United States military? It would be unthinkable these days to not have joint warfighting commands where we have Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, et cetera, all working together every single day, doing things as an integrated team. Why did that work? Because there is a clause in the Goldwater-Nichols Act that says if you ever hope to get to colonel or beyond, you have to serve in joint organizations. That was an incentive for integration. I would argue that in order to create whole of government, not just whole of military, we have to incentivize integration. That is actually much more difficult and much more complex, but I think the basic answer remains the same. That if we cannot create incentives for where every individual in the United States government believes, you know what, I'm going to be better off. My career, my paycheck, and my family are going to be better off by working with people that my organization traditionally has never worked with, then whole of government will prove forever elusive.
I think it's a matter of leadership, and I understand what Dov is saying here. I've seen some examples of whole of government working well. One of them I would give you is the Balkans, which goes back to the mid-90s. In the period between 1995 and the change of government in Serbia in 2000, my experience was that the whole government pulled together on a Balkans policy, largely because of leadership that came in that instance more out of the State Department than anywhere else, pulling us all together. But it required that everyone kind of let go of something and realize, in fact, I circulate an article to people in the government going back to the mid-'80s, and I still give it to students now, 1989, the Harvard Business Review. It's a very old article, but the main point of it is that power and influence in today's world comes to people who can deal with ambiguity and work across organizational lines. So this is a matter of leadership in our government. The example the general gave of joint duty is now being moving in that direction fitfully within the intelligence community, not without great success. If I had my way, if I was king, here's what I would do. I would say that if you're going to be a national security officer in the United States government, meaning Defense Department, State Department, military officer, intelligence officer, you spend your first year in a course with people drawn from all of those aspirant professions, learning about national security in the US government and how to work together. You build those ties right at the beginning. One of the problems now is if you're in the Defense Department, you don't really know a lot about what the State Department does, or if you're in the State Department, you don't know a lot about what the Treasury Department can do for you. I'll stop there because this could be a subject for an entire conference.
And guess what? It has been. Right here at CSIS, years ago when I was here, we had a project called, wait for it, Beyond Goldwater Nichols. And then it got picked up by something called the Project on National Security Reform. Dov, you may have been a commissioner, I don't recall, there you go. Yeah. And it laid out a blueprint for all of these things. And many of the people who were on that commission were people who went into the Obama administration at very high levels, including General Jones, Michelle Flournoy, I'm sure I'm forgetting many others. It was a very prestigious group. And what happened, all of these great ideas, which were very much in line with what you just articulated, creating a national security cadre that would rotate around the whole interagency and you couldn't get promoted until all of this, and restructuring the State Department and having, forward assistant secretaries of state to do regions so we wouldn't have, combatant commanders as kind of, modern day proconsuls. All of that met the reality of, the day-to-day crisis du jour and a new administration. But the plans are still out there. So I would recommend that we dust them off and see. And then in the near term, as we wait for that nirvana, I think there are shorter term examples of where leadership can make a real difference there. And I know through the Counter-ISIL campaign, for example, when Ash Carter was the Secretary of Defense, he and John Kerry worked together in addition to the Special Envoy, first John Allen, then Brett McGurk, to pull together the whole coalition and make it whole of government. In particular, Secretary Carter and Secretary Kerry really tried to work together and have meetings together to sort of say, what are we really doing today? Are your people working with my people? Are we working together out in the field? I think we have to work those near-term, top-down, leadership-driven things, but with the larger goal of a major restructuring.
Question right here.
Thank you. My name is Bob Holly. I'm a retired U.S. Foreign Service officer, and I'm here today on behalf of the Moroccan American Center for Policy. Dr. Hamre began this morning by observing in his introductory remarks that we pay sort of little attention to the Maghreb generally. John, you kind of echoed that in your introductory remarks, saying, why should we care about it? I was particularly impressed by the fact that Mr. McLaughlin said he thought it was a priority region, and General Nagata said he thought it was going to be a test case of whether we could effectively address these kind of problems without a major military intervention. Before I ask the question, I want to say thank you to CSIS for actually holding this conference on the Maghreb, so we are paying some attention to it, and recall that it was at least a dozen years ago when I attended the first conferences that CSIS did on issues in the Maghreb, so thanks for continuing to bring attention to the problem. My question is this, if it's true, as Dr. Hamre observed, that we pay so little attention to it, why do you think that the region gets so little U.S. attention? And what do people in the region have a reasonable right to expect from us in helping them address their problem?
Why does it get so little attention? I'll take a stab at it. Let me address the question of why does it get comparatively little attention? Well, the overly simplistic answer is because ultimately the United States government has to make choices about its priorities. There are, it is a more straightforward path to identify how U.S. vital interests are affected in other locales around the world. It doesn't necessarily make North Africa or the Maghreb less important. It's just easier to see how our vital interests are affected in other parts of the world than it is when it comes to Africa. You may not agree with this. This is an assertion I made in a recent conversation about this part of the world when we were debating an aspect of strategy. I made the argument, and it did not win universal support, but I made the argument that very often we tend to see our interests when it comes to this part of the world not through where I would argue our interests ought to lie, and that is with the people who live in this part of the world themselves. In other words, the people of North Africa. Very often we tend to see our interests indirectly through the lens of our interest in European security and stability. Now, I'm not saying that's illegitimate, but it tends sometimes to obscure what I would argue is a just as pressing need for us to care about security and stability in North Africa. But anyways, it's less straightforward, so as a result, it gets less attention.
We just have another minute. We have a waiting congressman, which is always a dangerous situation.
All I would say is we need, among other things, a stronger State Department. In my experience, a lot of the attention that things get in the U.S. government comes from strong ambassadors who project and their staffs who project an understanding of a region forcefully into the government. And I think we are less than strong right now in that regard through no fault of the State Departments.
I want to thank my panelists for a really, really searching and thoughtful discussion. Please stay in your seats. We have Congressman Jerry Connolly coming in about 3 minutes. We have to move some furniture around, and we'll be right back. Thank you very much.